If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.
The people who provide advice on P3s for the main part are people who make their living selling them. I think that's a fair statement. So just what are public-private partnerships, and how could anything that sounds so sexy be so hurtful to taxpayers? Well, as some have mentioned already, it used to be called private finance initiatives, and it still is in other places. But public-private partnerships, the term itself is incredibly broad and can include just about anything you can imagine. This is the definition that the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships uses. I quote, "A corporate venture between the public and private sectors built on the expertise of each partner that best meets clearly defined public needs through the appropriate allocation of resources, risks, and rewards." How could that be so bad? Well, that definition is, as I say, pretty broad, and it covers anything and everything from contracting out of services to full privatization. And it probably does, it does for me at least, I suspect for you, add more to confusion than it does to clarity. For the main part, however, people who are critical of P3s are opposed to the private financing and operation of public sector projects. We do not have a problem with private design, construction of those projects, design, build. In fact, we believe the public sector has always been involved in, and they actually do a very good job in our view. So if I was to define P3s, I would say a public-private partnerships is the handing over of long-term control of public asset or service to a private sector in an agreement which sometimes involves private financing.
There is one caveat, and you're going to be hearing this a lot from me in regard to capital projects in the years ahead. We're going to insist on one condition. The Partnerships BC take a hard look at how that project might be built as a public-private partnership.
We've seen the impact of these projects when our own members were involved. And in BC, the Hospital Employees Union, which is the healthcare service division of CUPE, in 2002, the provincial government brought in legislation to tear up those collective agreements. And the legislation eliminated successor rights, and it allowed, in fact, it encouraged unlimited contracting out of the work to companies offering half the wages and half the benefits. Now, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I'm sure you all know, did a study on what happened to those workers who lost their job. And both Richard and Deborah have talked a little bit about what the travesties are that are happening in health. And only to say that travesty of what happened in that instance is not how I agree all P3s end up, but this was really our first significant experience in British Columbia. And if you want to know what a public-private partnership looks like to us, then just ask the people who lost their jobs and had their wages slashed. They'll probably give you the best definition.
In fact, I can tell you today that we're going to be making that a condition of provincially funded capital projects as over $20 million in the future.
Well, P3s, as been mentioned, had their origin in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government. And part of the reason for the P3 agenda was simply ideology. And that hasn't changed significantly, in particular in British Columbia. It still is and continues to be just an ideology. Margaret Thatcher believed that the private sector could do anything and everything better than the public sector. But there was more to it than that. As the World Bank noted in one of its studies, I quote, "The driving force behind 3Ps may not only is not only a quest to increase economic and social efficiency, but also the ability to bypass expenditure controls and to move public investment off budget and debt off government balance sheets by exploiting loopholes in current fiscal accounting and reporting conventions, unquote. That's the World Bank, that bastion of social conscience.
A clear consensus emerging, at least in this room. I hope it's followed in other rooms out there, that local governments are an important part of the solution, that by striving to be able to partner with the private sector in the local capital markets, we actually may put ourselves on a very virtuous path for development.
David Gavigan of Northern Ireland Strategic Investment Board told last November's meeting of the Council of Public-Private Partnerships that PFI was seen, remember that term, I quote, as a cunning ploy to take transitions off balance sheets. Gavigan continued, but that sense of uncomfortableness of being off the balance sheet really permeated people's perceptions of PFI and remains in some people's minds as being slightly dodgy. Now, I really like that slightly dodgy phrase. The temptation for governments to look at ways to hide debt is a strong one. We saw what happened here in British Columbia. But the BC government was mugged by a gang of aggressive accountants. Hard to find, I must say. But BC's government now admits that borrowing will be necessary, but they're still working very hard to keep P3s off the books. One of the consequences of that is that British Columbia, we have now reached a point where we actually have more long-term non-debt financial obligation than we do in long-term debt obligation. Debt is one very important issue. I don't deny that, and I'll come back to it. But the big selling point for P3s is value for money, or risk transfer. That really is the key word.
We know P3s save money, transfer risk, and add great value.
Let's look at those cost issues for a moment. One of the arguments made for P3s is that they bring money to projects that would not otherwise be available. And you often hear that there's a huge municipal infrastructure gap in Canada, and you usually hear along with that that P3s can be used to fill the gap by bringing in private money. And who wouldn't want to do that? In Australia, and Australia has been mentioned once already because it really is the flagship of countries in P3s. And the State of New South Wales Treasury Department had this to say about it. I quote, "Even though social infrastructure may be financed by the private sector, the government, through payments made through the contract's life, will ultimately fund it. These payment commitments are as real as those associated with servicing balance sheet debt. Private provision of public infrastructure is therefore not a magic pudding that can alleviate the resource constraints of all governments necessarily face," unquote. In terms of comparing the cost, governments in Canada can borrow money relatively cheaply, and that's been mentioned already, and there certainly is a reason for that. A loan to a government is largely risk-free to a financial institution, and if a government makes a mistake with a project, it can raise funds through taxes or whatever. If a private company makes a big mistake, it goes out of business, and the people who loaned the money are often in trouble. So loaning money to a company is a bigger risk, regardless of how good the company is or, in fact, how good the project is. Governments, at least in developed countries, are stable and usually pay their debts. Corporations less so. And that's no blow against corporations. Certainly we've seen that over the last couple of years, what's been happening on the multinational scene. So if you look at a blended rate of borrowed and invested capital, the public sector would have to pay a company probably somewhere between 3 and 5% more for them to finance a project than they would to finance the project through borrowed money. You still with me? Okay. Now just think, over 25 to 35 years, that is a lot of money when you start to talk about those 1-2 points in interest. In late January in British Columbia, the Municipal Finance Authority, and the Municipal Finance Authority is the group, the agency that borrows for our municipalities. And at that time, they could borrow money for 25 years for 4.6%.